Hello, Steve White, Trekboy89 for Steve Arts 89. Well, the Roddenberry Archives released 4 documentaries recently. One a conversation with Nicholas Meyer, one a conversation with Walter Koenig, one a conversation with William Shatner and Judith and Garfield Reeves Stevens about the Shatnerverse. And the one that was more interesting to me was a documentary about, well, the not making of Star Trek Phase 2. Now, what bothers me about Star Trek Phase 2 is the mythology around it. There's this idea that they only made Star Trek the Motion Picture because of Star Wars. And there'd be no Star Trek if it weren't for Star Wars, when it's really the other way around. Star Trek being a hit for years before Star Wars was even produced did establish that there was a science fiction audience out there and that there was at least some potential for a science fiction movie. And of course George was inspired by Star Trek, and it was one of the things he looked at. Yes, it was more based on the old serials and Flash Gordon and stuff like that, but Star Trek was an element. But yeah, basically what was happening was Star Trek really appealed to a younger audience, and the studios really only looked at numbers, and it didn't have high numbers, but they weren't looking at demographics. And when they realised that the people that were watching were young, and that was the audience that they were looking for, they realised that they could have had a big hit had they actually put it in a good time slot. It would have been huge. So then they sold it in a syndication, and all the wonderful little syndicated networks put it on at a reasonable time, and it was a huge hit. The ratings were through the roof, and they could have had that in prime time had they actually put it in a decent slot. So then they wanted to do a new series, but they'd screwed Gene Roddenberry over, and he basically told them where to go, and it didn't look like there was going to be a series. But fortunately, Lou Scheimer charmed Roddenberry into coming back and doing an animated show, and I think that sort of eased Gene with the idea of going back to Star Trek and doing a Star Trek series. And I think there was talk of a series first, but then they were going to do a TV movie, and possibly a series of TV movies if it did well, because I think scheduling, people didn't want to commit to a series like Nimoy. There were issues. So they were talking about that for ages. Then, independently of that, Paramount decided they wanted to create a fourth network, their own network. And they were like, well, what can we do to make this network a success? Okay, we'll take this show that's in syndication that everyone loves and put it on our network so people have to go to our network to see it. They did the same thing with Voyager. Instead of putting it into syndication like Next Generation, Deep Space Nine, which were huge hits in syndication and had a huge audience, and they were just accessible to everyone, and they had a lot of people discover Star Trek in that era, and they had this just huge phenomenon happening. They decided to put it on their network and thought, well, we'll get all those people to come and watch it, and we'll make our network a hit by making all those people watch Star Trek on our network. Well, the network was never a hit. It failed a year or so after Enterprise was cancelled, and it hurt Star Trek because just it limited the audience. And Voyager and Enterprise get criticised because of the numbers, like that's some sort of indication of quality or worth, but it really is just because it was on UPN. But yeah, so they couldn't get through the financing of the series because they couldn't sort out the financing of the network. So the network failed, and they couldn't afford to do the series because it was expensive, and now the networks wanted to produce it because they'd just been rubbing that in their face, like, oh, we can have our own network with our hit Star Trek show. And then when the network failed, they're like, well, would you like to put Star Trek on your network? They're like, oh, sorry, don't you have your own network for Star Trek? So yeah, they couldn't get any of the networks to do Star Trek. And I'm not sure they were sure what to do with it, but they didn't actually cancel it right away. It was in production right up until 3 weeks before they switched to the motion picture. But they didn't tell anyone that the network was cancelled. They were trying to keep it quiet, and they didn't tell anyone. They would just rolled on with the production, the post-production. And Star Wars had hit already, and there was some people saying, well, why don't we do a Star Trek movie? Because Star Wars was big, well, Star Trek would be big. But some people were smart enough to know Star Trek isn't Star Wars, and it won't be a hit just because you do a film. So they were going to push on with the series. But then when Close Encounters of the Third Kind came out, and it was a serious science fiction film, and it was a hit, they realised, oh, damn, we could have had a hit with an actual science fiction show. There is a movie sci-fi movie audience out there, and we could have had a hit movie. And that was when they decided to do Star Trek the Motion Picture. So they gave up the idea of the illusion of them doing this series, which I don't know what they were suggesting was going to happen. If that decision hadn't been made, they couldn't have made the show. There was no syndication framework to put it in like they did 10 years later with Next Generation. So, but either way, they just switched the production over 3 weeks from beginning to film without Nimoy. They went into production and started the motion picture. They had to scrap a lot of the stuff that was made for the series because it wasn't made to the standards they needed for a big screen adventure. And the people they brought on for the film wanted different things, so a lot of the stuff was scrapped. But all the costs for all the development for the movies that didn't happen and the TV series they started to produce all got rolled into Star Trek the Motion Picture's budget. So it was always seen as a modest success because even though it did make a lot of money, it cost a lot of money, and they always acted like that was the fault of Star Trek the Motion Picture. And then they produced Star Trek 2 in the TV arm of Paramount, and they made it for less money, not that much less than what Star Trek the Motion Picture cost on its own without all the other costs. But, it was always considered more successful because, it was financially, I guess. Even though it didn't make less money, it cost less. So, unfortunately, that became the template for everything after, and everything has been just the good guys chasing around some villain in a spaceship, and it's like villain of the week now of every movie and every series. Even Starfleet Academy has a villain. That's just the Khan template that they've decided that's what Star Trek is. It's a bad guy in space that the good guys have to blow up with their phasers, and that's Star Trek to those people. So, and the general audience. So we're never going to escape, I don't think, the Khan template. But that's how we ended up there. But I just thought it was just interesting to see the detail they went into explaining what happened with the Paramount Network, and it's good because a lot of people seem to think that Star Trek was just doing nothing, and then Star Wars came out and they said, well, we've got that Star Trek property, why don't we do a Star Trek film? And that's all it is. I've even heard members of the Star Trek cast say that's what happened. Clearly they weren't in the loop. But it was just nice to see this documentary really go into that detail, because it's something that people don't seem to know or don't seem to understand, because there's this myth that they're sort of combating with this documentary. But I really loved it, and I'd like to see more. I'd like to see more of what they're actually planning to do on that series, and I really want to hear information about all the episodes that were written. There were 13 episodes that were written. A couple were produced as episodes of Next Generation and fan films, but I really would like more information about what that series could have been, because I think it's the lost Trek, and it would have been a really interesting era, and something I wouldn't mind them doing now. If they're going to do a reboot of Star Trek, they should do Phase 2. Paramount should do Phase 2 with a retro style show, but still, today's production values, but sort of that retro style in between, more developed than the original Star Trek, but closer to what they would have done in the 70s. But with today's production value, could be really interesting, and you could have the same dynamic of a 5-year mission with Kirk, Spock, and McCoy, but not try and reproduce what they did in the original series or remake what they did in the original series. I think it could be a really interesting thing, but it'll never happen, because that's the best, smartest, most interesting thing. That'd probably be the most successful, and they're not going to do that. They're going to keep going on with Kurtzman's everything but Star Trek approach, where they just slap the Star Trek, brand on any other type of show, and just hope that that's successful, for its other elements, not for Star Trek, because they don't think Star Trek really has a fan base or has any value. So it's just, what could have been, what could be. I can't believe I'm still talking at 9 minutes. I keep trying to make this video short. It's like the second time I've done it. But I'm going to go. Feel free to share, like, comment, subscribe. Let me know what you think of what happened with the development of Phase 2 and the Paramount Network. And, I just think it's really interesting. And have a look on my channel for other videos on similar subjects, because, YouTube will not be putting them in your, on your, what, not wall. I want to say wall like Facebook. I'm like, it's not a wall. It's not a channel. I've got a channel. You have your feed. I'm going to go.